I'll be describing experiments on this large rock squeezing machine that give us clues about the underlying physics of foreshocks. So let's imagine that we have a cluster of earthquakes. We might ask, is a bigger one coming? And I'm going to ask the question, well, what's happening in between the rupture areas of those foreshocks? Is the fault locked? Is it creeping? Did one foreshock trigger another, or are they all collectively triggered by some common process? There are two end-member models for foreshocks. In one case, the foreshocks are just standard earthquakes that trigger each other through standard stress transfer and happen to trigger an earthquake that met favorable rupture conditions on the fault and got big. In the other side of the spectrum, you have a pre-slip model which says that all of these foreshocks didn't trigger each other. They actually were collectively triggered by some aseismic slip that was the nucleation of a large earthquake. In order to understand the difference between the two models, we have to understand a critical nucleation length scale, H star. Earthquakes are thought to start with some slow and stable slip, and as that slow slipping region expands, it eventually reaches a critical nucleation length, and then it goes unstable and creates an earthquake. And we find that in the lab, this length scale is on the order of 1 meter. So how do we know this? Well, we built a big rock squeezing machine. We ordered a bunch of steel, we drilled holes in it, we plumbed high pressure hydraulics, we have these large 3-meter long berry granite samples. We lift them up with the crane, we put them in the machine, and the way this machine works is there's these two blocks and there's an interface that separates the two, which is the simulated fault. And this array of hydraulic cylinders squeezes the two blocks together, and this array of cylinders pushes one against the other so that it gets pushed forward and slip occurs on the rock-rock interface and on this low friction interface behind the hydraulic cylinders. And what's cool about this big machine is that we can actually image the nucleation process, how slip instabilities begin, and in some cases we can get a rupture to stop and not rupture through the entire fault, but only rupture part of it. We're able to measure that with slip sensors. We have an array of 16 slip sensors that go down the length of the fault that measure local fault slip. And if we color code them, so we're pushing on the red end and the blue end is the far end, and we look at that slip sensor data as a function of time, we can see that suddenly there was a slip event here, and many of the sensors showed some rapid slip, about 35 microns of slip for this magnitude -2.5 event. Some of the slip sensors, like this blue one at the far end, didn't show any slip at all. And some of the slip sensors showed some slow precursory slip that preceded the slip event. Now, this data on the right is the exact same data, it's just plotted in a different way. Now I'm showing the distribution of slip along the fault, and I'm laying down a snapshot of that distribution once every millisecond. And then I color code these snapshots, transitioning in color from light pink to dark purple, so that when the individual contours separate, that indicates rapid slip. And when they're so closely spaced that we can see this pink-purple color banding, that's slow fault creep. In this case, about 20 microns per second. And then you can see the slip accelerated out of the side of this creeping region and then ruptured very quickly. In this case, the nucleation region is about 1 meter in length. And this is essentially our H star, or our critical nucleation length scale that we observe in the lab. And we can do this at a number of different circumstances. What I was showing you is something that happened at 4 megapascals, and in this case we get a nucleation length that's about 1 meter and before the earthquake ruptures through the rest of the fault. At 10 MPa, that nucleation region gets a little bit shrunk in space and time, so it's a little bit less than 1 meter. In other cases, we can see that part of the fault was creeping, and right at this transition between the creeping and the locked section, we saw a nucleation emerge, also with length scale close to 1 meter. So what is this length scale for natural faults? Well, if we take a look at the underlying parameters that are thought to make up the length scale, and we scale them to what we expect for natural faults, we find that the length scale should be rather small, 1 meter or less, for highly coupled or locked faults. But some faults are able to accommodate aseismic slip on regions that are much larger than 1 meter. particularly subduction zones, those faults that are often composed of velocity strengthening materials, the length scale could be much larger, maybe on the order of tens of kilometers. So the difference between this cascade model and this pre-slip model really has to do with the size of this length scale. If the length scale is small, we get a cascade model, and this may be a reasonable model to describe foreshock sequences to the 1992 Landers earthquake, Hector Mind, and the recent Ridgecrest earthquake. But other faults, particularly subduction zones, may have this really large nucleation length scale, and we might be tempted to suggest that these foreshocks are just like little stronger or more brittle patches that ruptured and created earthquakes within the nucleation region of a much larger earthquake. But we've been really neglecting heterogeneity. Even in the lab, here's a picture of our lab fault. We get scratches and little smears and grooves and things, but in the lab, the heterogeneity is far milder than what we would expect in the Earth. And that heterogeneity has curious effects on the way that earthquakes initiate. Even in the lab, we can see this. So if we take a look at the 10 MPa experiment where the nucleation was smaller, and then the 4 MPa experiment where it was a little bit bigger, at 2 MPa, the nucleation length scale is close to the whole length of the sample, and we can see that the whole sample is kind of creeping. And we can see a nucleation that's on the order of 2 meters coming out in this case. But that was one event in a sequence of events. And some of those events nucleate very differently. Instead of having an apparent nucleation length scale of about 2 meters, it shrunk. It seemed to nucleate initiated just out of nothing. And if you can see here, it's nucleating near a stuck patch. So most of the fault's creeping, but one part of the fault's not creeping. And that's where the event initiates. In addition, if we take a look at the slip that's occurring right at the center of this nucleation region, for the large nucleation, the slip is following the expected 1 time to instability relationship shown in gray. But for these other events that are initiating right on a stuck patch, they're starting to follow that, but then suddenly they start slipping way faster than expected from theory. This is just a one-dimensional view of this process, but if we imagine what it would look like if we projected onto the fault plane and we had a couple of bumps that were sort of stuck or high normal stress and some slow aseismic slip that was propagating along, that could cause, because it kind of wrap around the bump and cause some unstable slip to happen and a big earthquake ignites, okay? So this pre-slip model that we're talking about, it doesn't actually make much sense as long as you include realistic heterogeneity. If you do, it means that these small seismic events can actually jumpstart a large rupture. So sure, you can have a cluster of seismic events that are collectively driven by some aseismic slip, but the aseismic slip may or may not be the nucleation process of some earthquake. However, every little seismic event that gets triggered is kind of probing the fault and testing it. And if those fault conditions are favorable, they can just ignite a large earthquake. And this is consistent with the observation that small and large earthquakes initiate similarly. So just to conclude, we're able to image the initiation process of laboratory earthquakes. We find that it's about 1 meter in the lab. If we extrapolate the lab parameters to what we expect for seismogenic faults, we expect that nucleation length scale to be very small. So the cascade model of nucleation is the most likely candidate. However, heterogeneity has a strong effect. So even on faults that creep and many subduction zones, they may have clusters of foreshocks that are driven by some aseismic slip, but each one of those foreshocks could potentially ignite a larger earthquake. So I think this is one of the challenges that we're faced with when trying to predict earthquakes, even using coupled seismic and geodetic data.